quiet kind of pain changes an empath forever. Not anger, not distance, not even betrayal by itself. The real damage begins the moment an empath realizes their kindness is no longer safe around someone they trusted deeply. Most people think empaths can handle endless emotional pain because they always seem calm, patient, and understanding. They forgive more than most people ever could. They stay longer than they should. They keep trying to see the good in people even after being disappointed again and again. But very few people understand the emotional line that silently breaks them inside. And the frightening part is that this line is crossed every single day in relationships, friendships, and even families without anyone noticing the damage until it is already too late. An empath rarely changes suddenly. The transformation happens slowly, quietly, one painful moment at a time. First they explain less, then they stop opening up emotionally. Then one day the person who once cared the most becomes emotionally unreachable. Psychology experts often describe empaths as people with extremely high emotional sensitivity and deep emotional awareness. They naturally absorb the emotional energy around them, which is why many empaths become emotionally exhausted without understanding why. Research on emotional empathy also shows that highly empathetic people process emotional pain more intensely than others, especially when trust is involved. This is why emotional betrayal affects them so deeply. What looks small to another person can feel emotionally devastating to an empath because they do not simply hear words or see actions, they feel emotional intent beneath them. And once an empath begins feeling emotionally unsafe around someone, the connection slowly starts dying internally, even if they continue acting normal on the outside. In this video, you will understand the one emotional boundary empaths almost never recover from once it is broken. You will learn why empaths give endless chances, why people mistake their patience for weakness, why they suddenly become cold after years of kindness, and why the final stage of an empath's emotional detachment is usually silent, not dramatic. You will also discover lesser-known psychological truths about emotional trust, emotional exhaustion, and the hidden reason many deeply empathetic people disappear emotionally without warning. The ending of this video is especially important because most people completely misunderstand what truly causes an empath to emotionally shut down forever. And once you understand that hidden trigger, the behavior of empaths will start making much more sense. So stay with me until the end because this topic is much deeper than most people realize. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights about human behavior, emotional intelligence, relationships, and the hidden patterns behind people's actions, make sure to subscribe and join us for more videos like this. Most people leave when they see the first warning sign. An empath usually stays, not because they enjoy pain, not because they are blind, but because their mind naturally searches for reasons behind behavior instead of immediately judging it. Where other people see attitude, an empath often sees hidden pain. Where others see distance, they see emotional wounds. And where most people finally give up, an empath keeps trying to understand what happened to the person underneath the behavior. That is why empaths often remain connected to people long after the relationship becomes emotionally unhealthy. They remember the good version of someone even while experiencing the painful version. They hold on to emotional memories stronger than emotional reality. And many people take advantage of this without realizing the emotional damage they are creating over time. An empath does not connect with people in a shallow way. Their emotional attachment becomes deep very quickly because they naturally absorb emotional energy. They notice small emotional shifts in tone, silence, facial expressions, and behavior that most people ignore. This emotional awareness creates powerful connections, but it also creates emotional vulnerability because once an empath emotionally invests in someone, they do not simply walk away after one painful experience. Their first instinct is usually understanding, not separation. They try to explain the behavior in their mind. Maybe the person is stressed. Maybe they are emotionally overwhelmed. Maybe they are carrying hidden trauma. Maybe they did not mean what they said. Maybe they are struggling internally. Empaths constantly search for emotional explanations because their hearts naturally want to repair emotional disconnection instead of abandoning people. This is why many empaths become emotionally trapped in painful relationships for far too long. They become emotionally attached to potential, Not just reality, they keep believing the person they first connected with is still somewhere underneath the damage, and this creates one of the most emotionally exhausting cycles an empath can experience. They continue giving emotional energy while slowly becoming emotionally drained themselves. Psychology often describes this behavior as emotional over-identification. Highly empathetic people sometimes internalize the emotional struggles of others so deeply that they begin prioritizing another person's emotional pain over their own emotional well-being. Over time, this creates emotional imbalance. The empath keeps giving understanding while receiving emotional inconsistency in return. But because empaths are naturally patient, this imbalance can continue for months or even years before they fully accept how unhealthy it has become. Many empaths are also deeply uncomfortable with emotional abandonment. They know how painful rejection feels emotionally, so they try very hard not to become the source of that pain for someone else. Even when they are hurting, they continue staying emotionally available because leaving feels cruel to them. And this is where many people misunderstand empaths completely. Their patience is often mistaken for weakness. Their forgiveness is mistaken for emotional dependency. Their kindness is mistaken for low standards. But the truth is much more complicated. Empaths are usually fully aware of the pain they are experiencing. They simply keep hoping emotional honesty and understanding will eventually repair the connection. They believe enough love can heal emotional distance. Enough patience can heal emotional confusion. Enough compassion can heal emotional damage. But repeated disappointment slowly changes this belief, because even the most understanding empath eventually reaches emotional exhaustion. Empaths do not leave after the first betrayal. They leave after repeated emotional disappointment. They leave after continuously explaining their pain while feeling unheard. They leave after forgiving the same emotional wounds too many times. They leave after realizing their emotional effort is no longer creating emotional safety. That process is usually slow and invisible. Most people never notice it happening because empaths rarely announce their emotional breaking point out loud. Instead, the disappointment quietly builds internally. Small moments begin stacking on top of each other. A broken promise here, emotional invalidation there, manipulation disguised as jokes, vulnerabilities used during arguments, dismissed feelings, emotional inconsistency. Over time, these moments slowly reshape how the empath feels emotionally connected to someone. But even then, many empaths continue trying. They continue hoping. They continue searching for the version of the person they first believed in. That emotional hope is often what keeps them trapped the longest. They keep hoping the version of you they believed in is still real. And that hope can survive far longer than most people understand. Even after emotional betrayal, even after emotional neglect, even after deep disappointment. Because empaths do not just love who someone currently is, they love who they believe that person could become. That emotional attachment to potential is powerful. It makes empaths incredibly loyal, but it also makes emotional detachment extremely painful once reality finally breaks the illusion. Eventually, a moment arrives that changes everything internally. Not always a dramatic moment. Sometimes it is incredibly small. A sentence, a reaction, a betrayal during vulnerability, a cold response during emotional pain. A moment where the empath suddenly realizes their emotional safety no longer exists around someone they deeply trusted. And that is the line most people never see coming. The line is not anger, it is not arguments, it is not normal mistakes. Healthy relationships survive conflict all the time. Empaths understand human imperfection better than most people do. They know people make mistakes. They know emotions can become messy. They know nobody is emotionally perfect. But there is one emotional wound that changes the way an empath sees someone forever. Making an empath feel emotionally unsafe after they trusted you deeply. That is the line that silently destroys emotional connection inside them. Emotional safety means more to empaths than almost anything else because their emotional world is already extremely intense internally. They do not casually open their heart to people. When an empath becomes emotionally vulnerable, they are exposing parts of themselves they protect from most of the world. Their fears, their insecurities, their emotional wounds, their sensitivity, their private thoughts. Their emotional trust is sacred to them. So when someone mocks their emotions, dismisses their pain, manipulates their vulnerability, or uses their openness against them, the emotional damage goes far deeper than most people realize. To others, it may seem like a simple argument. But to an empath, it feels like emotional betrayal at the deepest level. Many people unintentionally destroy emotional trust with empaths because they underestimate how deeply empaths process emotional experiences. A sarcastic comment about their sensitivity may seem harmless. Publicly embarrassing them may seem small. Ignoring their emotional pain during vulnerable moments may seem temporary, but empaths emotionally absorb these moments in ways that stay with them for a very long time, especially when the pain comes from someone they trusted deeply. Trust changes everything for an empath. Once trust is created, emotional defenses lower completely. And once those defenses lower, emotional wounds cut much deeper. That is why betrayal affects empaths so intensely, not because they are weak, but because they loved sincerely. Many empaths can handle external criticism from strangers without much emotional damage, but emotional harm from trusted people affects them differently because emotional safety was already established. And once emotional safety disappears, love slowly begins disappearing with it. That process usually happens internally long before anyone notices externally. An empath may still continue the relationship, they may still talk normally, they may still show kindness, but something inside them quietly changes. The emotional openness becomes more guarded. The emotional warmth becomes more cautious. They start observing instead of fully participating emotionally. And the painful part is that most people completely miss these signs because the empath does not always express the emotional shift immediately. Instead, they slowly begin disconnecting internally while pretending everything is still okay externally. The moment an empath feels emotionally punished for caring, they begin disconnecting internally. That emotional punishment can happen in many ways: mocking their sensitivity during arguments, calling them dramatic after they express pain, turning their vulnerability into ammunition, repeatedly making them feel foolish for caring deeply, invalidating emotions they trusted someone enough to reveal. These moments create emotional danger inside the empath's mind. And once emotional danger becomes associated with someone, emotional distance naturally follows, because the empath's nervous system slowly starts understanding that emotional openness is no longer safe in that connection. This is why empaths often become quieter instead of louder after repeated emotional hurt. Many people expect emotional explosions, but empaths usually collapse inward emotionally before they fully walk away. They begin speaking less about their feelings because they no longer believe they are emotionally understood. They stop explaining their emotional pain repeatedly because repeating themselves becomes exhausting. They begin emotionally retreating into silence. And this stage is extremely dangerous for relationships because it is often mistaken for emotional stability when it is actually emotional detachment beginning internally. The empath who once communicated constantly suddenly becomes quieter. The person who once fought to preserve the relationship stops fighting completely. The emotional effort disappears slowly. Their eyes lose emotional warmth. Their responses become shorter. Their energy changes. But because they are still physically present, many people assume the relationship is still emotionally intact. In reality, the emotional separation has already started. Empaths rarely explode immediately because they spend a long time emotionally processing pain before reacting to it. They analyze everything internally first. They replay conversations in their minds. They question themselves repeatedly. They wonder if they are overreacting. They try to remain fair. They search for emotional explanations even while being hurt. That emotional self-analysis delays their breaking point. But once they finally reach it, the emotional shift becomes extremely difficult to reverse. Because by the time an empath emotionally detaches, they usually spent a very long time trying to avoid reaching that point at all. The dangerous part is that most people notice the empath leaving emotionally only after it is already too late. They notice once the empath stops caring enough to argue, once the emotional reactions disappear, once the emotional chasing stops, once the empathy that once held the relationship together begins fading away. That is when panic often begins for the other person. Suddenly they try harder. Suddenly they become emotionally attentive again. Suddenly they notice the distance. But the empath is no longer emotionally standing in the same place internally. Too much emotional damage has already accumulated beneath the surface. They may still smile, they may still answer messages, they may still remain polite and calm, but internally the attachment is fading. And emotional fading is much harder to repair than emotional anger. Anger still contains emotional investment. Silence often means the investment is disappearing. Once an empath emotionally detaches, reconnecting becomes incredibly difficult because empaths rarely detach casually. Their emotional withdrawal usually happens after deep internal struggle, after countless attempts to preserve the connection, after repeated emotional disappointment, after exhausting their emotional energy trying to fix what the other person kept damaging. By the time they emotionally pull away, they often feel emotionally empty rather than angry. And emotional emptiness is one of the hardest emotional states to reverse. Many empaths describe this stage as emotional numbness. The nervous system becomes exhausted from carrying too much emotional stress for too long. Constant emotional betrayal creates emotional fatigue that eventually changes personality traits people once admired in the empath. The warmth becomes caution. The openness becomes emotional distance. The endless patience disappears. And many people misinterpret this transformation completely. They call the empath cold without acknowledging the emotional damage that created the change. But emotional coldness in empaths is often learned self-protection, not natural cruelty. The empath who once understood everyone begins protecting themselves from everyone. That shift does not happen overnight. It develops slowly after repeated experiences where emotional openness resulted in emotional pain. Over time, the empath's mind begins associating deep emotional vulnerability with danger instead of connection. And once that psychological association forms, emotional walls naturally begin appearing. This is why some empaths eventually become emotionally selective about who receives access to them. Not because they stopped caring about people, but because they finally realized unlimited emotional access can become emotionally destructive when given to the wrong individuals. Self-protection begins replacing emotional openness. The empath who once gave endless chances starts observing behavior more carefully. They stop ignoring red flags. They stop making excuses for emotional inconsistency. They stop sacrificing their emotional stability just to preserve relationships that continuously drain them. And while this change may appear cold externally, internally it is often survival. Many empaths spend years emotionally abandoning themselves while trying to emotionally support everyone else. Eventually, the exhaustion becomes unbearable. They realize they cannot continue carrying emotional pain that nobody else seems willing to acknowledge or repair. That realization changes them deeply. Some empaths become more emotionally distant. Some become quieter. Some stop sharing personal emotions altogether. Some completely disappear from unhealthy relationships without dramatic explanations. And people are often shocked by this transformation because they only remember the endlessly patient version of the empath. They never imagined that version could emotionally disappear. But what many fail to understand is that emotional patience is not infinite. Even the deepest empathy has emotional limits. And once those limits are repeatedly violated, emotional shutdown begins naturally. People often call empaths cold after the damage, but they rarely acknowledge what created that change. They rarely acknowledge the emotional manipulation, invalidation, betrayal, inconsistency, and exhaustion the empath silently carried for so long. They notice the emotional walls but ignore the emotional wounds behind them. And this creates another painful reality many empaths experience. They are often blamed for the emotional distance that was actually created by repeated emotional harm. The empath becomes accused of changing, while nobody acknowledges how much emotional pain forced that transformation. This is why many empaths eventually stop explaining themselves altogether. They become tired of defending emotional reactions that were created by prolonged emotional damage. Some empaths do not stop loving because they stopped caring. They stop because caring became emotionally dangerous. That is the part many people never fully understand. Empaths usually continue caring long after they should. They continue understanding long after they feel emotionally hurt. They continue giving chances long after trust begins breaking internally. But eventually the emotional cost becomes too high. Their nervous system can no longer handle constant emotional instability. Their mind can no longer ignore the emotional patterns. And their heart can no longer survive repeated emotional disappointment without protecting itself. So the empath slowly changes. The softness becomes guarded. The openness becomes selective, the emotional availability becomes limited. And the saddest part is that many empaths never wanted to become this way at all. They wanted emotional safety, emotional honesty, emotional consistency. But repeated emotional pain taught them lessons they could no longer ignore. So no, the one line you should never cross with an empath is not making them angry, it is making them regret trusting you. Because anger eventually fades, arguments can be repaired, mistakes can be forgiven. But the moment an empath feels emotionally unsafe with someone they once trusted deeply, the connection begins changing in ways that are very hard to reverse. That is the part many people realize too late. Empaths are not remembered for how loudly they leave. They are remembered for how deeply they loved before they finally disconnected. And when an empath reaches the point where they stop explaining their pain, stop fighting for the connection, and stop trying to heal what keeps hurting them, the emotional distance becomes almost permanent. Because once an empath realizes their kindness is being used against them, their mind slowly begins protecting the heart that spent too long protecting everyone else. They may still forgive you emotionally, they may still wish you well, they may still carry no hatred toward you at all. But they will never see you the same way again. The emotional safety is gone. And once trust dies inside an empath, the version of them that loved without fear slowly disappears with it. Some of the quietest heartbreaks in life come from realizing the person who once understood you better than anyone has emotionally stopped reaching for you. Not because they stopped caring overnight, but because caring started costing them their peace. If this felt personal, it is because many people silently live through this kind of emotional exhaustion every single day. Many empaths spend years giving endless understanding to others while secretly feeling emotionally drained themselves. And if you connected with this message, just know that your sensitivity is not weakness, your emotional depth is not a flaw. The ability to care deeply in a world that often rewards emotional coldness is rare. Never let painful experiences convince you to hate the part of yourself that once loved sincerely. And if you want more deep psychological insights about empathy, emotional intelligence, human behavior, relationships, and the hidden patterns behind people's actions, make sure to subscribe to the channel and become part of this community. Like this video if you related to any part of it. And share it with someone who keeps giving chances until they finally choose peace over pain.